Who likes to eat food? Yeah, me too. Have you ever had like a wonderful dinner? I want you to just imagine, close your eyes and imagine that wonderful feast that you've had. And you have leftovers. And so if you're at a restaurant, you box it up very carefully, or if it's something at home, you put it in a good container because it's lunch tomorrow. Anybody do that? Now, I know some people hate leftovers. I love leftovers. But have you ever had that experience where you've got that little box and it's all ready for lunch tomorrow, and then you open the refrigerator to get it for lunch, and somebody else, the children, have eaten your lunch? Has it ever happened to you? And bitterness grips your heart. We've been talking about that bitterness, haven't we? It wasn't lunch, but I destroyed my wife a few weeks ago in this way. I'm just, confession is good for the soul, so I'm confessing. After Easter, you know, all the Easter candy goes on half price. And so I bought one of those big packages of the Reese's Easter eggs because they're my favorites, right? And I brought them home and I had them sitting there and I ate them all. And Chris knew they were there and she came home from work and she's like, where's the Reese? They were gone. And so we've been dealing with forgiveness in our family as well. And we've all had moments in our lives, have we not? When someone has crossed the line, broken our trust, they've hurt us. And I'm not talking about lunch or chocolate. I'm talking about stuff today that's deep and lasting. And the closer the relationships are to us, the deeper the wounds tend to go. You know what I'm talking about, right? If it's your family or someone you trusted, that person that you thought had your back, and that pain goes so deep that sometimes we carry it for a very, very long time. That betrayal we carry for a long time. And I think, judging from the feedback I'm getting from all of you, I think most of us really do want to let people off the hook. We really do want to practice forgiveness, and we want to be free from that hurt that just keeps on gripping us. And so we're coming to a critical point in this message series today where I'm asking this question: how do you know if you've actually forgiven somebody? How do you know if you've actually forgiven somebody? Because we can say the words, we can pray about it, but it seems like that pain just keeps cropping up again. Anybody with me? Do you know what I'm talking about? That pain keeps coming back. You can't stop the memories from replaying in your mind sometimes. We can try, we can think about other things. I've shared a lot of skills with you in the last few weeks. But can we know that we're really walking in forgiveness? And I just want to tell you right now, spoiler alert, I'm going to give you the answer today, how you can know. And then we're going to look at somebody in the Bible that gives us a good example of how this is walked out in real life. And it's going to be great. But I'm going to just start with the answer for you today. How do you know? This is how you know. You ready for this? If you're taking notes, you're going to want to write this down. Forgiveness is revealed by how you treat the person who hurt you. Forgiveness is revealed by how you treat the person who hurt you. In other words, forgiveness isn't just an emotion, even though we would like our emotions to kind of regulate sometimes. And forgiveness doesn't happen automatically if you just give it enough time. I think sometimes many of us have believed that idea that if I just give it time, all my bitterness is going to go away. Probably not true if you don't do something about it. And so I'm going to start this message today by taking a look at the life of Joseph. And Joseph is a great Old Testament character. We find his whole biography in the book of Genesis. And he's great because Joseph is an example of somebody who forgave the people who betrayed him at the deepest level. And he shows us what forgiveness looks like as it's walked out. Now, I know many of you grew up in Sunday school. Many of you have been church people for a long period of time. But I also know we've got a bunch of people here at Connect who aren't as familiar with the Bible. It's quite possible we have lots of people in the room today who have never heard the story of Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph goes from Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50. It's a very long story. We're not going to read 14 chapters of the Old Testament today, okay? But I want to give you a summary of Joseph's life today, and he's going to be our springboard into giving you some markers of what forgiveness really looks like when we live it out in our lives today. So let's just talk about Joseph this morning. If you want to open your Bibles, you can follow along. I'm going to start in Genesis 37, where we pick up on the story of Joseph. Now, Joseph was one of 12 brothers. His dad actually had 2 wives. I don't recommend that for this reason. He had 2 wives, and one wife was his favorite. Okay? Trouble in paradise here. And the favorite wife's name was Rachel. Now, Rachel took a long time to be able to have children, so the other wife was having all these babies while Rachel didn't have any. And finally, when Jacob was an old man, Rachel finally had a child, and his name was Joseph. And because he was the firstborn child of his favorite wife, Joseph was his dad's favorite. Now, every once in a while, my sister will say to me, Russell, you know your mom's favorite. And because I'm diplomatic, I will say, yes, I am. All kinds of trouble come when you're the favorite. Genesis 37 verse 3 says, Jacob loved Joseph more than his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. Now I'm reading from the NLT. The old translations used to say a coat of many colors. Remember that? And if you grew up like I did in Sunday school and they had the flannel graph, they had the little images with all the color. You're nodding your heads, you know. Doesn't that image just come alive in your brain? That robe was a statement in Joseph's family. It was a statement that Dad loves me more than everybody else, and nobody was denying that that was the case. And so the other brothers, the 10 brothers, resented him. The 10 brothers by the other wife. They resented Joseph deeply. And then, really unfortunately, Joseph begins to have these prophetic dreams. Now, I believe in prophetic dreams. The Lord speaks to me sometimes in dreams, and I know they come from the Lord, and they're important things. And this started happening to Joseph. But because Joseph was a teenager at the time and he had no filter, okay, Joseph just started telling his brothers, I had this prophetic dream and God showed me that you are all going to bow down to me because I'm Dad's favorite. How do you think that went for Joseph? Not very well. He really should have just treasured it in his heart. Genesis 37:8 says, his brothers said to him, do you actually think you will reign over us? Do you really think you will rule over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way that he talked about them. And so one day, Dad sends Joseph out. They're all tending their sheep out in the wilderness, actually like many, many miles away. Joseph goes on this long hike because Dad sent him out to find out where the boys are. And the men see Joseph coming in his beautiful coat of many colors, and they say, here comes the dreamer. And one of them says, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. Let's just kill him. And so they grabbed Joseph and they threw him into a pit. And at that point, they began to argue over what they should do with him. it's nice to know that there was some kind of rational thinking in their minds. And so they decided not to actually kill him, but what they did instead is they sold him to a passing caravan of slave traders. Now, I can't imagine very many things that would be more betraying than selling my sibling into slavery. Now, if you're here with your sibling, not a good idea to sell them into slavery. And I'm sure that from the very beginning for Joseph, the pain began to go very deep. The brothers took the money and they headed back home and they stripped him of his robe and they dipped it in some animal blood and they told their dad the story that Joseph had been attacked by a wild animal and had been killed. And of course, Jacob recognized the coat that he'd given his son and he began to mourn that his son had been killed. And this is where we can begin to think about betrayal in our own lives. I've had lots of conversations the last few weeks with many of you who have told me your stories of betrayal. Just yesterday, somebody shared with me that they had a business partner that stole a whole lot of money. Betrayal, it goes deeply. Many of us have had siblings, like Joseph, who have done unspeakable things. Spouses who haven't been faithful. You know the pain. And whatever your pain is, you can relate to what Joseph is going through in this story. And it goes really deep. So Joseph is taken to Egypt by these slave traders, and he's sold to a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was a very wealthy and influential man. And as Joseph begins working in his household, Joseph is honoring God. Joseph is smart. He's wise. He's doing all the right things. He's making Potiphar money. So eventually, Joseph just gets promoted and promoted and promoted until he's basically the manager of a very large household. And he's doing well. And he's honoring God in spite of the fact that he's a slave in a foreign country. And then the unthinkable happens. Potiphar's wife decides that Joseph looks really good and she'd like to be more than just his boss's wife. And she hits on him, and Joseph runs away because he honors God. He's a godly man. He's not going to give in to that kind of temptation. And as an act of revenge, she accuses him of making a pass at her, and now Joseph gets thrown into prison. And so not only has Joseph been betrayed by his brothers, he's been betrayed by his boss's wife. And now not only is he a slave in Egypt, but he's an Egyptian slave who's in prison. And it just seems to go from bad to worse. But Joseph is awesome. And if you've never read the story, I want to encourage you to read the whole story sometime this week and read the detail. Joseph continues to honor God even though he's in prison. And he's got this gift. God gives him prophetic dreams, but also when other people have dreams, he's gifted by God to be able to understand and interpret the dreams for other people. So at some point, the prisoners start coming to Joseph and they're saying, I've had this dream. What does it mean? He tells them what they mean. And they get answers for their lives, and they make promises to Joseph. When I get out of prison, I'm going to remember you, and I'll help negotiate you out of prison, except nobody helped him. And Joseph sat in prison for years. Until finally one day, the Pharaoh, the supreme regent of Egypt, has a dream. And it's a prophetic dream that bothers him. And so he's seeking answers from all of his wise men and the sorcerers and the people that Pharaoh relies on. He's seeking answers, and nobody can tell him what the dream means. And then finally, somebody in Pharaoh's court remembers, hey, there's this guy in prison that understands dreams. Maybe he could give you the interpretation of the dream. And so Joseph cleans himself up. He goes to Pharaoh, and he is able to interpret the dream. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the meaning of Pharaoh's dream was there are going to be 7 years of abundance. Everybody's going to have great crops. Lots of produce is going to be brought in. And then after those 7 years of abundance, there's going to be 7 years of famine. And Joseph recommends to Pharaoh that we begin stockpiling food so that we are ready when the famine hits. And so Pharaoh, because Joseph was able to interpret the dream, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of the food collection, storage, and eventually the distribution. And after the 7 years pass of abundance, the famine hits, and the famine goes hard and deep. Everybody is impacted. All of Egypt is out of food. There's nothing growing. There's no rain. There's absolutely no productivity. And Joseph is in charge of these vast stores of food. What's interesting, when I was doing my research this week, archaeologists have actually discovered huge storage areas in Egypt that were made for storing food. There's no archaeological evidence for Joseph in Egypt, but his storage system is there, which confirms that the biblical story is historically accurate, which I think is awesome. And so Joseph is in charge of all of this food storage and then eventually distribution. And here's what's interesting in the story. The famine is so severe that it reaches not just into Egypt, but all the way back to Canaan, where Joseph's family begins struggling because they've got nothing to eat. At this point, Joseph is 30 years old. I want you to just imagine in your mind what it must have been like for about 13 years to go by since his brothers betrayed him, his boss's wife betrayed him, he's been in jail, and now he's somehow made it into Pharaoh's court. He's now very comfortable, but life has been hard for 13 years. And all of a sudden, his brothers show up in his court asking to buy food. The men who betrayed him into slavery, who robbed him of his relationship with his father and his mother and the rest of his extended family, these men show up in Egypt because they've heard Egypt has food. What's Joseph going to do? Now, it's a great story because the brothers don't recognize Joseph. I can imagine, I don't know if this is true, but I can imagine that Joseph is in full Egyptian garb, right? He is assimilated into so he's got the eyeliner on, and the little snake thing over his head, all of it. Of course the brothers don't recognize him, but he knows exactly who they are as soon as they walk into the room. What's he going to do? Joseph is now the most powerful man in the world. He could have had them executed on the spot, just snap his fingers, say the word, all of them just wiped out in retaliation. But instead, Joseph is put into this position in which his forgiveness is put to the test. What is Joseph going to do? And I would imagine that for 13 years, most people would have been rehearsing the revenge speech. Have you ever rehearsed a revenge speech? It can get ugly. And now that he has the power and he has the motive and here's the opportunity for paybacks, so many people would say, I'm going to get what's mine. But that's not who Joseph was. So the first thing he did, if you read the story, you'll learn the whole account. It's so fascinating. But the first thing he did is he wanted to test his brothers to see if they were the same snakes that they were all those years ago. That's my word, not the Bible word. He tested them to see what they were going to do. And next week, we're going to talk about how to test relationships. Because one of the things I shared with you in week 1 is that forgiveness does not necessarily mean you trust the person who hurt you again. If you forgive, it doesn't mean that you forget, because we can't forget. And it doesn't demand that you reconcile or trust somebody again. So that's going to be the topic of next week's message, is how do you figure out if you can trust somebody again? Joseph didn't automatically welcome the brothers back into his life. He put them to a little bit of a test. And I'm not going to tell you how that all went, but at the end of the testing process, the brothers were able to show him that they had indeed changed. And Joseph decided that he was at the right moment, he was going to reveal to them who he was. And so just before he said, guys, I'm your brother, Joseph. Before he did that, and this will be significant when we get to these markers in a minute, the first thing he did is he cleared the room. He didn't want any of the Egyptians to see what was coming next. So he cleared the room. He made sure everybody got out, and it was just Joseph and the 10 brothers. And this is what he said. I'm picking up in chapter 43, verse 3, if you're following along. He said, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. Can you just imagine? They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Now understand, there had been a lot of time that went by. Joseph had sent them back to their father, and they came back, and there was this big back and forth. They had gotten to know him as a political leader of Egypt. They had no idea. So this was just this mind-blowing revelation, right? Please come closer, Joseph said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. And then I love what he says next. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Is that mind-blowing to anybody else? He doesn't just give them food and send them back home and say, tell Dad I send my warmest greetings. Instead, he invites them back into relationship, and not only that, but he invites all of them, their wives, their children, all of their households to move to Egypt, and he arranged for them to have a huge plot of land and relocate into Egypt so that he could take care of them. He provided everything that they needed. And they were safe and secure and well fed because Joseph understood forgiveness. Now, years pass, and finally their father, who was moved to Egypt with all of them, their father dies. And at that point that their father died, the brothers are terrified. And they're thinking to themselves, now that Dad's gone, this is when Joseph is going to take his revenge. They've been living in this tension of wondering when the shoe is going to drop, when Joseph is going to wipe them all out, and they had convinced themselves that it was going to happen once Dad was gone. But Joseph had truly forgiven his brothers. And so towards the end of Genesis chapter 50, Joseph says this to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. Would you just read that sentence with me out loud? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. And so Joseph shows us something really powerful. And it's this: forgiveness isn't ignoring what was done to us. but it's trusting that God is big enough to use it. And it tests our faith a little bit. Because what was meant to destroy you, God can use to actually deliver you. And I think there's lots of us here today that probably need to hear this message. I want you to know that the God you serve is the same God Joseph served. And he's big enough to take that wound you've been carrying and work it out for your good. But so much of it depends on whether or not you will choose to forgive. So now here's the question. How do you get from the pit to this kind of response that Joseph had toward his brothers? Or in other words, how do you know you've actually forgiven somebody? I'm going to give you 6 ways this morning to check your heart. And if you're looking at your watch, don't worry. This is not a 6-point sermon. These are going to go by fairly quickly, but I want to give you 6 checks that you can use to check your heart and ask yourself, have I truly forgiven? And before we get to all 6 of these, let me tell you, forgiveness is a process. There's probably not one of us in this room that can say we score a 5 on every one of these 6 tests. I did give you a little scale. If you've got a note card this morning, you could self-evaluate if you want to, or you could do this at home when the person who hurt you isn't sitting next to you. However you want to. I'm just kidding. But these are just ways to check your heart and ask yourself, on a scale of 1 to 5, how am I doing with each one of these heart checks that Joseph modeled for us? You understand where we're going with this? Okay? We're going to check our hearts today. Here's the first check. I'm calling it the reputation check. The reputation check says you don't weaponize this story. And this is why I wanted to really emphasize that when Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, he cleared the room before he took his hat off and said, look, this is who I am. He cleared the room. He didn't want to shame his brothers for what they had done in front of all of Egypt. He was passing the reputation check. Because when you've truly forgiven, you stop looking for chances to tell other people what they did to you. Why do we like to tell other people? Well, we want to prove they were wrong, right? We want to be vindicated ourselves. I was in the right, they were in the wrong. Sometimes we tell other people to get revenge. And the story becomes a weapon that we use to damage that person's reputation. And when we see Joseph here protecting his brother's dignity, instead of showing everybody in Egypt what terrible people they were, he was passing this reputation check. And so the question that I want to ask all of us this morning is, if you're working through the process of forgiveness today, can you protect the reputation of the person you're forgiving today? This morning when I was going through this list again today, I thought about my wife and how she has always protected me. I am not a perfect husband. I know that's a shock to many of you. I hate it when she laughs the loudest on those self-deprecating moments. But when we were newly married, she was working in a laboratory, and all the women who worked in the laboratory would eat lunch together. And I remember after a week or so of her working in this lab, she came home and she said, all they do is they sit around this table and they all badmouth their husbands. And she said, Russ, I want you to know I will never speak poorly of you to my coworkers, ever. And there have been times over the years that she had every right to badmouth me to her coworkers and anybody else who would listen. And I don't believe she's ever done it. She has never weaponized the ways that I've hurt her in any way, because she understands the importance of that reputation check in protecting my dignity and protecting how other people think of me. The second check is this. It's the payback check. This one says you don't make that other person pay emotionally. I think it's really interesting that the Bible account is so specific about how terrified Joseph's brothers were of his retaliation. And they lived in guilt and fear for years because they knew what they had done to Joseph was a terrible, terrible thing. And so Joseph's first move after he cleared the room was to try to take away their fear. He didn't want them to live with the emotional weight of constant guilt and fear. And I think one of the biggest hurdles that we face with forgiveness is letting go of the payback. Because if you really feel like somebody owes you a debt, they've stolen from you, or they've hurt you in a way that you just have to absorb, you just want to pay them back in some way. And so we want them to feel the pain we felt when they did that thing. And we can use language and sarcasm and little subtle reminders, and we kind of enjoy watching them squirm. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And especially if the tables have turned and we've got a little bit of power. I mean, there's an axiom in the English language, revenge is sweet. And we think about how that's going to taste when we watch them squirm under our thumb because the tables have turned. That's not forgiveness. And so you know you've forgiven when the collection agency in your heart has stopped trying to make them pay. That's the payback check. Closely related is the third check. It's the guilt check. And the guilt check says you don't need them to carry the weight. I love the line where Joseph says, don't be angry with yourselves. I think some of us really want the other person to be angry with themselves. But once you get to the point where you recognize that guilt and shame are debilitating, and when we're angry at ourselves for something we can't undo, it just puts us into prison. And so if you really want to let somebody off the hook, if you really want to forgive somebody, the kindest thing you can do from them is to take away that guilt and that self-inflicted anger if you can. So when you've forgiven, you don't need them to grovel. You don't need them to demonstrate their guilt and contrition to make you feel okay. You will be free when you've stopped tying your peace to their level of remorse. That's the guilt check. Now the next one we see in Joseph, and I've already touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to name it here, is the narrative check. Joseph protected his brother's dignity by reframing the story. So he flipped the narrative. Instead of, you did me wrong, he said, God sent me ahead of you. And I want to make a really critical distinction right here, because it would be easy to misunderstand what the message of the scriptures are here. Joseph isn't saying that God made the brothers sell him into slavery. The Bible says very clearly that God is not tempted, and he doesn't tempt people to sin. So what the brothers did in selling their brother into slavery was sin. Can we all agree? They sinned. They did a really bad thing. But here's what Joseph is acknowledging, that God has enough power to flip everything around so that sin turns out to benefit Joseph, and it turns out to benefit the entire family, because God had a plan that couldn't be undone. Could God have gotten his plan done without selling Joseph into slavery? Absolutely. God can do anything he wants to. But because they sinned, it didn't undo God's goodness and his plan. And so for all of us that need to forgive someone, this narrative is an important tool for us to put into our forgiveness tool belts. Take control of the narrative and recognize that God is at work even if somebody has harmed you deeply. God is that big. So what I love about Joseph here is that instead of framing the brothers as villains in this story, Joseph framed God as being in charge. So, for you, for me, can we tell our story without that person who hurt us being a villain? Can we reframe the story so that we can begin to see? And sometimes the further away from the story you get, the easier it is to see what God is doing. But even early in the process, can we begin to speak with eyes of faith and say, I know that God is at work. Even if I can't see what he's doing yet, I have enough faith to believe that what that person intended for evil, God is going to use for good. That's the narrative check. And it requires a lot of faith on our part. But if we believe in the bigness of God, it's where we can live. Number 5 is the kindness check. This one is tough. Just going to be honest. The kindness check. This is where your patterns of energy begin to change. And it's just one line in the Bible. Joseph promised his brothers, I will take care of you. And so what we see Joseph doing is, instead of spending all of his energy on resenting them, he started spending his energy on blessing them. And I'm not talking about just being nice to somebody. I'm talking about doing something tangible to be kind. Joseph gave them food. Joseph gave them a new home. Of course, Joseph was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. And he'd also figured out that he could probably trust these guys. They were doing the right things at this point in their lives. But we can do kind things, even to people who have hurt us deeply. To follow Joseph's lead, maybe you could take a meal when they're sick. Or you could send a birthday card. Or you could just shoot a really nice text. And maybe the most practical one, especially if it's somebody that you can't trust, you can pray that God will bless them. I talked about this last week. It's probably the most important kind thing you can do, is to pray that God will bless the person who has wounded you. It's amazing what praying for blessing for another person will do for your own heart. And it begins to move you from bitterness to forgiveness when you just start doing kind things. And this is where forgiveness just shows up in really practical ways. Here's the last one. Anybody else squirming? Are you squirming? These are hard, aren't they? Okay. Here's the last one, and then you can breathe a sigh of relief. This one's too soon, Q. Too soon, yeah. The last one is the consistency check. This is where forgiveness holds up over time. And I already told you the story that years later, after their father had died, the brothers were in a panic again. But Joseph's response was exactly the same. His forgiveness was consistent over years. And so what we need to remember is that real forgiveness doesn't have an expiration date. And I don't know. Some of these are harder than others. I think this is one of the hardest ones because it's really easy for us to bring up old wounds. Am I right? When you get angry at that person again, all of a sudden the list starts populating, like, right? Because we all have that list in our brains. Or when you've got a new conflict that arises, the list just starts populating again. And I see this so often in couples that Chris and I are counseling, or we're helping work through some problems. Man, it's so easy to keep a list. And we've forgiven and we've let that person off the hook for that thing that happened in 1997. But all of a sudden, when they do something stupid, all of a sudden we just start using that as ammunition again. We're not passing the consistency check when we keep bringing all that stuff back up. And so I just want to remind you, you know that you've forgiven when you're no longer recalculating the debt. Letting somebody off the hook means the debt is erased. So I just want to remind you one more time today. Forgiveness isn't about what you say. It's not even about what you pray. Forgiveness is about how you treat the person who hurt you. It's revealed in your actions. And I was thinking about this morning. There's no better example of forgiveness than Jesus. Jesus went to the cross and he absorbed the cost of our sin. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. He prayed for us. And then even though we blow it again and again, Jesus just keeps blessing us. And we come back to Jesus and we say, Lord, I need your forgiveness again today. And he doesn't say, well, that's number 452. I think you need to grovel a little bit. Jesus says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's actually not Jesus, that's John, but John was Jesus' disciple, so it probably came from Jesus. And because Jesus forgives and forgives and blesses and blesses and blesses, I believe that's the most empowering thing for us, is to get our eyes focused on Jesus. And when we're grateful for what Jesus has done for us, we are empowered to extend forgiveness to other people. Even when it costs us something deep, something expensive. Jesus absorbed the cost of my sin. Can I absorb the cost of somebody else's debt? It's not easy, but it's what Jesus calls us to do. So forgiveness is revealed by how you treat the person who hurt you.